we have biases that prevent us from being able to properly evaluate our own thinking.
So I was reading, I read Emily Wilson's book, The Case Against Socrates, which I thought was interesting because she famously has this biography of Seneca, and they're both pretty negative. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel like she both dislikes Seneca and Socrates, which in a way was refreshing. Like, I think it's always good to see the critical side of a person. But Socrates especially is so beloved and celebrated historically. It was interesting to read, like, kind of a steelman case against Socrates, which is what I kind of felt like she was doing.
There's I.F. Stone's book, The Trial of Socrates or something like that it's called, where he deliberately sets out to kind of portray him as guilty.
Yeah, to convict him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's kind of got an obvious agenda, right? It's biased. I don't think it's a balanced portrayal of Socrates.
Hers or his?
I haven't read hers actually, but his is definitely kind of self-consciously biased.
Well, it's interesting because what I sort of took from it is, like, for all of Socrates' brilliance, there was a lack of social intelligence, perhaps. Like what I thought was so interesting, that you have theoretically the wisest man in the world, and he's kind of surprised by this whole thing.
Well, I'm going to say the thing that I find with Socrates is he's just riddled with paradoxes, right? Because at the same time that you say that, Epictetus, like 400 years later or whatever, says to his students something really weird about Socrates. He says the main thing that you guys could learn from Socrates is how to engage in philosophical debates without it degenerating into a quarrel. Yeah. So he thinks Socrates exemplifies some kind of social skills.
Except it does end in a quarrel, and they kill him.
Getting executed. Yeah. Yeah. But and he got beaten up sometimes we're told he got beaten up in the street and things like that. Yeah. Like, and also they tried to execute him several times. Like the oligarchs tried to execute him as well. Yeah. Like, I mean, we don't even know how many times they tried, like possibly like 3 or 4 times. There was this trial where the mob called for him to be executed as well. Like, so I'm counting like maybe 3, 4 times like the Athenians tried to kill him.
Well, there's that Andy Warhol line about how art is getting away with it. Have you heard that? Socrates doesn't get away with it.
Spot on.
You know, like there's something about, I'm not saying he's wrong about any of the things, but there's at some level he manages to be right and upset everyone in being right. Yeah. And there's something wrong about that.
Yeah, that's a paradox. He sort of gets away with it until he doesn't. He gets away with it until he's like 71 or 72 though, which is not bad.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean he makes it through the 30 tyrants.
Yeah.
But there's you're right, he is paradoxical because Diogenes the Cynic just basically rejects society completely. And then you might have Seneca, who is a philosopher but very much inside the system. Seneca says, like, a philosopher should be different on the inside, but on the outside be exactly like everyone else and be able to operate in, not just in public life, but at the height of public life. And Socrates is kind of somewhere in the middle, and that he's transgressive, but you're right, not so transgressive that they have to nip it in the bud. And yet in the end, it does catch up with him.
I'm going to try and avoid saying the word paradox every 2 minutes, right? But like everything about him is paradoxical. He's the Greek word that they use, Plato uses for him, is atopos, which is hard to translate, but it kind of means out of place, like kind of weird, like a misfit. But at the same time, he's the quintessential Athenian philosopher. In a sense, he couldn't be more like Athenian, but he's also kind of out of place, and they see him as a misfit. Yeah. He's kind of apolitical, but he's also besties with Alcibiades, who he's kind of like seemingly grooming to become the ruler of Athens, like almost like a proto Alexander the Great. Like he has this vision about uniting all of Greece and maybe even invading Persia. So he almost is a bit like Seneca advising Nero in terms of his relation with Alcibiades. And he had other powerful like political figures that were associated with him as well. But he also hung out with prostitutes and slaves and, you know, you name it.
and slept outside and
Yeah.
was just he's just it's a fascinating sort of series of contradictions. And I think what I was most struck by is that the vehemence of the backlash and seems to catch him by surprise. Like, for someone who's so wise and such a good reader of people, he seems to be surprised. Like, he calls himself the gadfly. But what do people do with flies?
Yeah.
They swat them.
Yeah. So there's argument, he's clearly asking for it. And Plato portrays him at some points as kind of like in the Gorgias. He's portrayed as kind of anticipating the fact that he's going to run into a problem like this. Actually, also in the first Alcibiades, like, which is set much earlier, he kind of says something that foreshadows, Plato has him kind of foreshadowing the fact that he's going to run into some danger because of the Athenian state. But then in Xenophon, you get him saying stuff like, he implies that Socrates thought he was becoming elderly, and he was at risk of losing his faculties, and he didn't want to become a burden to his friends and family. So he kind of rationalizes it a bit and says he wasn't afraid of dying because he felt he'd kind of, in Greek society, he'd reached this age where he saw his life is approaching its natural end anyway. Yeah.
Although he does, he leaves in such a way that is the opposite of not being a burden. Well, I don't even know how I would say this. He essentially leaves his family to fend for themselves.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's something kind of unsympathetic about the way in which he makes himself. It's like he makes himself a martyr, right? In a way that is not aggrandizing, but it's like he was insisting on the martyrdom, and at every step they were willing to let him off the hook in some way.
Yeah, it's definitely possible that it's kind of by design, and he saw this as an opportunity to grandstand. There is, I think it's in Xenophon, there's a Greek word that refers to that means big talk. Right, it's a little bit ambiguous.
Yeah.
And he says that he upset the jury because of his big talk.
Yeah.
I mean, for somebody who says his philosophical method is meant to be a kind of therapy for alleviating people of intellectual conceit or arrogance, this is kind of a big part what Socrates claims to be doing. In court, he came across to them as being incredibly arrogant.
Yes.
And that upset them.
Yeah, there's for someone who had been so artful for so long and had gotten away with it for so long, there is kind of a boneheadedness to his approach. So for people who haven't read the book or don't know about Socrates, Socrates gets sentenced to death. But I think when you dig into the details, there's this
spoiler alert.
Yeah, he does. He dies in the end. There is this kind of revealing little detail, which is a certain percentage of the Athenians, but by no means a large majority, vote to convict him. And then Socrates has to give a speech where he gets to explain, he gets to plead for leniency or propose a punishment. And his speech goes over so poorly that more jurors vote to sentence him to death than to convict. So there are, but what that means is that there were people who thought he was innocent, who found the speech so obnoxious and repulsive that they deserved. They believed that the speech deserved the death penalty, not the actions themselves.
Which is part because we're not told that much about what offended them about that. He says his punishment as an alternative to the death penalty. So normally he would have suggested exile or some heavy fine or something like that. But he suggested he should be given free meals for life, basically.
Like an Olympian's pension.
Yeah. And that, for some reason, that really upset them.
It's almost like it was impious. Like he committed the crime. One of the crimes is sort of impiety to the gods. He basically commits it in front of the jury. If you think about it.
There are many odd things about, so throughout that trial, Plato portrays him as saying men of Athens to them. And so it may be that he's also offending them by not saying men of the jury. Like he's not really, and Plato has him kind of implying that he doesn't really recognize their authority as his judges. And he goes on this whole thing about puncturing intellectual conceit and questioning the wise and finding out they weren't really wise and finding out that no one really possessed moral wisdom. But all that time, the subtext is he's standing in front of the jury that are about to judge him. So he's kind of implying, look, none of you guys understand the nature of justice, right? By the way, so that probably aggravated them as well.
Well, that's the paradox, right? Socrates is the man who knows that he knows nothing, and yet, like, we read the dialogues today, and they're brilliant and interesting. But it struck me thinking about, in the moment, if you actually were on the other side, he would come off as a complete know-it-all. He's doing this thing that's incredibly obnoxious, like when you're in a discussion with someone and they're like, I don't know, but here, let me tell you all the problems with your thing. And then you go, but I don't know, right? It's this kind of, he's clearly criticizing other people without necessarily owning that criticism. And I suspect that would have been extremely aggravating.
One of the strange things about him, I'll try to avoid saying paradox again, is that the sophists set themselves up to be experts or wise men. So knowingly, they would say, I am wise. I am an expert. You guys should all come and listen to me. I'll give an amazing speech. Go away and memorize it. And Socrates, rather than assuming the role of an amazing teacher, kind of casts himself more in the role of a really artful and skilled student. So he, rather than giving lectures, typically, he's the one asking questions. But that also means it would be like you're attending, and often he's at the lectures of sophists and asking them these questions. So it does potentially make us think of being at a lecture, and then there's some guy sitting at the back,
a heckler,
just heckling and asking loads of really provocative questions. And it could be the rest of the students all turn around and think, this guy's more interesting than the dude giving the lecture. But it's also quite disruptive.
Yes. Well, and it was interesting. I read your book, and then I read this biography of Ben Franklin. And what I thought was so interesting is here you have another guy who brings wisdom down from the heavens, like literally, like brings lightning, like discovers electricity effectively, right? He's brilliant, he's wise, he's philosophical, but he also has this sort of social acuity that allowed him, he too kind of was disruptive and transgressive, but he managed to do it. He would write these letters from a pseudonym. He kind of assumed this character. It was just fascinating to watch this other guy who has a long life in public service at the highest level and effectively has no enemies.
Yeah.
And it was just like, oh, okay, Socrates was this brilliant person who we can learn so much from. And then he also kind of has this other thing which a lot of intellectuals and very brilliant people struggle with, which is, how do you engage with other people? How do you get people to change their minds? And how do you do it without alienating unnecessarily wide swaths of the population? I mean, today, most people don't think philosophy is for them. We have a different version of that problem. But it just struck me as that sort of the tragic flaw of Socrates, even though we see him as this kind of humble figure, was a kind of arrogance, but then also indifference to other people's feelings.
Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, we said he survived the plague of Athens. He survived the whole Peloponnesian War, even though he fought in it. And loads of Athenians were killed in the war. Lots of hoplites were lost. And, you know, he took all these risks. Like, he lived quite a dangerous life, involved with politics and so on. Alcibiades got assassinated. Like, Socrates survived a bit longer. So, in some ways also, I think we can see evidence in the dialogue. We have to qualify everything by saying the sources that we have are semi-fictional, not completely reliable, contradictory, ambiguous, blah, blah. But in the literary account of Socrates that we have, he does exhibit, in some ways, quite a lot of social skills. Right, I think. There are some situations where he's able to question people quite provocatively, but he also compliments them at the same time, right? And he also steel-mans their arguments sometimes, right? And then there's other times where he's portrayed saying things that do seem quite tactless. Like, he says something that seems quite insulting towards Critias, the guy that becomes the head of the 30 tyrants. So he upset the wrong guy there. Like, and then it sounds like Critias had a kind of vendetta against him after that.
Sure. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like none of this knowledge, wisdom, whatever, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. We perceive Socrates only on the page now, and whether he was right or wrong. But being right or wrong also exists within a social context and a political context, and just that. I think that's, to me, what's so fascinating about the Stoics is how, as it makes its way from Greece to Rome, they have to navigate that. It's a philosophy not for the classroom or the garden, but a philosophy for life, and life is filled with complicated, petty, vindictive, angry, powerful people.
Well, look, I mean, when I was writing the book, that was kind of one of the things that excited me about it. I think it's often the case that classicists and historians can see there's a really amazing story. That's become that used to be well known, perhaps in the ancient world, and then becomes kind of inaccessible somehow over time. Like most people today would say they know Socrates drank hemlock, and maybe that's about all they know. Maybe they've read a bit of the Republic,
or they know
something.
The method.
They don't really know that much. I mean, many people are surprised to know that he served in the military. There's a lot of stuff they don't know about him, and to some extent I think that's because in the dialogues, again, on the one hand, where he's portrayed almost like in a play, interacting with famous historical figures. There are references to historical events, but despite that, he still comes across overall as if he's in a kind of bubble, and he's wandering around in pleasant groves or in gymnasia, chatting about abstract stuff, while the world is kind of falling apart around him in a sense. They're in the middle of this epic war that he's involved in, and he's dealing with these key political figures in it. So our impression of Socrates is somewhat abstracted from his historical context. But Marcus Aurelius would have had a much stronger sense, for example, even many centuries later, that Socrates was this flesh and blood, rounded figure that fought in the military, that knew key political figures, that lived through a plague. And, everyone that studies the classics knows that. But I just kind of felt it's not even like the story of some historical figures' lives is kind of boring in a way. But Socrates' life is really colourful and dynamic. He knew these amazing people and did amazing things. And we're kind of sleeping on this in a way. People don't know about it. It would make in some ways, it would almost make a good movie. And so I kind of wanted to find a way to bring it to life, almost like a movie or a graphic novel or something. I mean, really, like a lot of books, I'm sure many authors do this, maybe you do this as well, that when I'm writing, I kind of think, what's the book that I would have wanted to have, if I could go back in time and give my 17-year-old self a book about Greek philosophy, what would it look like? And I think it would be like an adventure story that really brings the history to life and weaves the philosophy into it. And like you say, makes it more connected to real life. Socrates was said to be the first philosopher who brought philosophy down from the heavens and applied it to daily life. And, he doesn't even do that consistently. Sometimes he talks about pretty abstract things. But the thing that caught my eye, also coming from a background in therapy, as a cognitive behavioral therapist, there are more so also in Xenophon. So we have Plato's dialogues, but we also, a lot of people perhaps don't know that we also have a load of dialogue, like 30 or 40 dialogues from Xenophon, one of Socrates' other students. And there were many, many other dialogues that circulated in the ancient world that are lost today. In Xenophon, who perhaps influenced the Stoics as much or even more than Plato, the dialogues tend to be shorter. And some of them look remarkably like cognitive therapy. There are a couple in particular that I don't have any hesitation saying look a lot like someone doing relationships counselling. There's one, I'll tell you what they are, just so, because we need concrete examples, because most people have read the Republic or things like that, maybe they've looked at the Apology, and you see fragments of this kind of therapeutic Socrates in those. But in Xenophon, there's one where he's talking to Lamprocles, who's his eldest son, and Lamprocles says, I just can't put up with my mum nagging me. He's probably 15, and so it's this teenager complaining about his nagging mom.
To his dad.
Yeah, and he's really angry about this. And so Socrates does something that resembles relationships counselling or cognitive therapy with him. And he's not talking about metaphysics.
What does he tell him?
Well, the first thing he does, interestingly, is something that he seems to be known for doing. He does in other dialogues as well. His opening gambit is to say, do other people feel the same way about your mum that you do?
Yeah.
Right? And so, I know he gets a bit of pushback against this, but this is a key move in cognitive therapy as well, right? Because the cardinal problem, in my view, in psychotherapy, is we have beliefs, thoughts, opinions, judgments about the world, and we look at the world through those, like
Sure.
we're looking through a coloured lens. So something happens that psychologists tend nowadays to call cognitive fusion, right? So I think my mum's unbearable, right? Now I just see her as being unbearable. I don't make a distinction between my judgment that she's unbearable and the external person.
The Stoics would say that your opinion is that she's unbearable.
Yeah.
She is not objectively unbearable because there's an interplay between the two of you.
The two things just become fused together normally, though. And so we have to start therapy by prizing them apart and getting me to realize, no, the unbearableness comes from your opinion, your judgment about your mum. That's your impression of her. It may or may not be accurate. It might not be the whole story. And one way to prize these two things apart and make me aware that the judgment comes from me, is to start saying, do other people all see her in the same way? He does the same thing with two of his best friends. There's a guy called Chaerephon, who is Socrates' lifelong friend, and also seems to maybe be a philosopher as well. Like he's kind of almost his constant companion, but we don't hear that much more about him. But he's a really eccentric character as well. He's described as the bat, and he's kind of manic, and he's described as being very gaunt.
Yeah.
Right. So he's a colourful character. And Chaerephon is the one that goes to Delphi and asks, "Is any man wiser than Socrates?" Right.
Yeah.
So he's a very intriguing figure. His little brother, Chirocrates, falls out with him and refuses to speak to him because of some squabble over inheritance, right? And Socrates is with them and he thinks, I need to do something about this. So he starts talking to Chirocrates and he says, what's up? And he says, my brother's just a royal pain in the butt, and he's just absolutely unbearable. He's really mad with him. You can tell from the way he's talking. And again, there's a lot of pushback. He's like, you don't understand. The guy's an idiot and da-da-da-da. And Socrates says, but does everybody view him in the same way, right? And he gets pushback against this, but he's just beginning to prize apart the value judgment, the opinion from the external person. There are other emotions are available. Like there might be other ways that you could view and interpret your brother's behavior. And this is how cognitive therapy usually begins as well. This is what we sometimes call cognitive diffusion or cognitive distancing. Like it's creating this distinction between our opinions and the things to which they refer that then becomes integral to Epictetus' Stoicism.
The handles. Which handle are you going to grab?
Which handle you use. There's more than one handle, buddy. So Epictetus says people aren't upset by events, but rather by their opinions about them. And no one ever quotes the next sentence of the same passage where he says, for instance, and he goes straight for the jugular, he says, death isn't inherently terrifying. Because if it was, Socrates would also have been terrified of it. And Socrates provides a famous role model of somebody who exhibits equanimity in the face of his death. So there's another perspective on death that's available, right? Yeah. It's not the only way of viewing it. It's not intrinsically terrifying. Like some people aren't terrified of it. Your mom isn't intrinsically annoying.
Yeah.
You
can say a lot of things about Socrates. He was obnoxious. He was annoying. He could have been more socially adept. Mm-hmm. But you can't say he wasn't brave. And you can't say that he didn't stick to what he thought was true.
He saved the life of at least one officer, possibly two. And I think he probably had a reputation for being a brave infantryman or hoplite. Also, let's throw in some trivia, right? Like some geeky stuff. I think the way Socrates is exhibited, so Xenophon, who was a famous Athenian general, has a bunch of dialogues where Socrates shows pretty intricate knowledge of training and tactics and strategy. So some people think that must just be Xenophon putting these words in Socrates' mouth. However, it's not necessarily so, because Plato also shows Socrates talking to two generals, lackeys in Nicaeus about military training, right? And so it may be that Socrates wasn't an ordinary hoplite. He may have been more like a centurion or a sergeant major. He's a guy that's comfortable liaising with senior officers and seems to actually have had training. Like, he's had some kind of education in military strategy and tactics, right? So
it's interesting. I wonder how much of our understanding of Socrates is a projection of our understanding of philosophers now. Mm-hmm. So we think of philosophy and philosophers as somewhat superfluous, somewhat abstract, somewhat pedantic. We think of them as removed from, everyday life. We have this idea that they're not athletic. We have our understanding of Socrates, or our understanding of philosophers today. If you were to tell someone to imagine a philosopher, I think we just dress that up in a toga and put it in Athens, when in reality his biography makes it clear that this guy's physically fit, this guy's hardy and tough, this guy's engaged in public life, he's good at helping people solve practical problems. People want to be. He is annoying in some ways, but young people clearly want to be like him. Yeah. He's interesting and impressive and inspiring. Yeah. All the things that philosophers are not today.
The Greek word they use for him is he has a megalosouchia, I believe, is the Greek word, which means like a big soul. And this is a term that the ancient Greeks used to refer to somebody who had, I'm not sure what the English equivalent would be, like someone who's just has a really striking character, who stands out head and shoulders above other individuals of their time. And they said that of Alcibiades and Socrates, so that makes it even more interesting that the two were associated. Yeah. So Athenians would be like, these are two of the most kind of outstanding figures of our lifetime. Yeah. And they were perceived as being, I guess you could say in completely different ways, incredibly charismatic or striking or memorable people.
Yeah, and it's interesting how far we are from that today. Like you couldn't pick a series of words to be further from your person's average conception of a philosopher today.
Yeah, they're ensconced in an ivory tower. Yeah. Whereas Socrates was doing philosophy on the street with prostitutes and slaves and also famous politicians. He was in the agora, and that's, which is like a shopping mall. Who does philosophy in a shopping mall?
Socrates is as far from a philosopher today as Jesus is from your pastor of a mega church. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like it's striking and profound, and in some ways kind of gotta be almost an indictment.
And I guess that's the thing about the fact that we have these dialogues. The dialogues, although the setting is sometimes kind of minimal, they're quite wordy at times. They're all set somewhere, right? And they're often set in gymnasia. Yeah. So, like, an ancient Greek gymnasium was like a big park, and it mainly had running tracks. It had paths that you'd walk along. It had a palestra, a wrestling school. People would do pancration, like mixed martial arts type thing. And there'd be also libraries and shrines, and there'd be people giving baths. Talks. Yeah. So it was a hub, or I guess like a recreational ground where there was education, religious ceremonies, but also a lot of sports going on. And that's the setting. Yeah. And I guess in some ways it's hard for us to fully understand what's going on with Socrates' philosophy because we don't really have a direct equivalent to that environment.
We certainly don't think of Socrates as an athlete, but Epictetus says he's the world's greatest athlete. Right. He says that a life demands, or a philosophy is the art of catching the ball and throwing it back, catching the ball and throwing it back. And he says Socrates is the world's greatest athlete in this regard, that he takes the situations and the obstacles and the balls that life throws at him, and he catches them and throws them back up to the very end when he's brought in front of this tribunal and faces this great trial. And so the idea of Socrates as Socrates and philosophers as being both literal and metaphorical athletes is, I think, a very striking way to think about it.
I think things like their experience of wrestling as well shaped Greek and Roman thinkers. Like sparring made them view, Marcus Aurelius uses this as a metaphor for life. That our sparring partner isn't somebody that we resent, even though they're throwing us on the ground and beating us up and stuff like that. Like, we're choosing to use them as a training partner. Yeah. And we should see adversity that we face and misfortune in life in a similar way. The gods are giving us the stuff to deal with, and it's a test of our strength and our coping ability. Yeah. I think that brings me back to something else, actually. Like, somebody said something weird to me the other day, Ryan. I was doing another podcast with this young guy, like he's kind of influencer in the UK, and he said to me, "Do you have a problem with self-help?" And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, I think there is a problem. There's definitely a problem with self-help literature and the self-help field. And I do try and kind of talk about it in this book, because I thought Socrates would raise questions about the self-help field that we have today. And one of them is this, that let's start with this. In therapy, in the initial assessment where we're talking to clients, the first thing we normally do is look at their coping strategies. Like, how are you currently dealing with your anxiety? Yeah. And how's it working out for you? And the strange thing is, people will usually have coping strategies that they have mixed feelings about, right? So they go, well, I try and control my breathing, or try and relax my muscles when I get social anxiety, or something like that, or repeat a mantra, right? And I kind of feel like it helps a bit, right? But then the therapist might think, but why are you in therapy, right? You're still here.
Yeah. Something's not working.
Yeah. We often find clients, over and over again in therapy, you find clients that have extensive libraries of self-help books, right? So they'll joke about it. They'll go, I'm a self-help junkie. I've read every book that's going. I've done every course that's going. But they still kind of like end up in therapy or in coaching or whatever, because they still have stuff that they're struggling with. And in some ways, I think what's lacking, one of the things that's lacking, is that when people read some self-help books or go to some websites and things, they kind of get stock advice. Yeah. So, here's a strategy like breathing, here's a strategy like mindfulness, here's a strategy like assertiveness, off you go and just use it. And what we tend to find is that people will take strategies that might work short-term, but then become problematic long-term, or that might work in one situation, but not so good in another situation, or that would work sometimes, but they're overextending it and using it all of the time, right? So it might be useful, for example, to relax all the muscles in your body if you're lying in bed at night and you're kind of stressed and you want to get to sleep, perhaps. But if you're doing public speaking and you're relaxing the muscles in your body, that can backfire because it can increase self-focused attention. And that's highly correlated with social anxiety. So it makes you pay too much attention to your own body and not enough attention to the audience. So we'll often find people with social anxiety are using what they think at first are helpful anxiety management techniques, but are actually backfiring in a way that they don't expect. And the way that we deal with that, what's different is, in therapy, we'd often sit down with people and say, what do you think are the pros and cons of doing this exercise? Or another way of doing it would be to say, is there a good way and a bad way of doing this? So people might say, I need to prepare for presentations that I'm giving. And the therapist might say, well, is there a difference between a good form of preparation and a bad form of preparation? Like, a bad form of preparation might go on and on and on. You might still be doing it at 1 a.m. in the morning when you're lying in your bed in your head. It might involve a lot of kind of catastrophic thinking and not really focus on practical things. It might be overly abstract and not concrete enough. So how would we distinguish worrying from preparation or problem solving? Most people often kind of confuse these things. So they think I'm preparing for my talk, and actually they're just worrying about it and making their anxiety worse.
Yeah, it's not constructive at all.
And so I thought that there's something about Socrates that makes me think of this. I think Socrates saw the sophists in particular as dishing out maxims, slogans,
one-size-fits-all kind of stuff.
Yeah, one-size-fits-all kind of advice, right? One of the things that really jumped out at me when I was reading Xenophon is there's this odd thing that people say Socrates never wrote anything, right? And yes and no, right? Plato says that Socrates wrote some poetry when he was in prison, and we even have what are purportedly a couple of lines from it, right? Although it's debatable how authentic they are. But Epictetus, again, says this really crazy thing about Socrates. He says at one point Socrates wrote more than anyone, but he never published any of it.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? Like, this is 400 years later, right? So are you sure about this? Like, he says Socrates wrote copiously, right? But he left it to his students to write things for publication because he wasn't interested in fame or reputation. So Epictetus seems to think that Socrates wrote, and he says he wrote for his own improvement. So, you know, you could say it sounds like he's saying he wrote some kind of journal or at least notes for self-improvement. And then you think, geez, if only we knew what that looked like, you know. But then you think, well, there are probably clues, right? We can't really know for sure. But in Plato's dialogues and in Xenophon, Socrates kind of talks at times about the sort of questions that he probably would have asked himself. And in fact, in one place in Xenophon, he does something even more explicit. He sits down with a young guy called Euthydemus. There are two Euthydemuses in the dialogues. There's one that Plato talks about and a different dude that Xenophon talks about. Now, Euthydemus is a self-help junkie. He's
Turn your mic a little bit. I think that's good. Yeah.
He's eerily similar to clients that we'd see in therapy today, right? He has an extensive library of books, and Socrates says he's been memorizing and learning the maxims of the wise, right? And he thinks he's achieved a lot in self-improvement terms. But when Socrates questions him, he ends up being quite confused, and he realizes that he doesn't really understand the goal of life or the nature of justice. So he needs some help in that regard. And Socrates does an exercise with him, like a written exercise. And he seems to describe drawing two columns, right? Now that immediately jumps off the page at me because it's exactly what we do in cognitive therapy.
Yeah.
Right? We get a flip chart and we draw two columns. And we do this in a number of ways. So we'll get a belief that's provoking anxiety or depression, like something awful is going to happen and I won't be able to cope with it. And we'll say, okay, one column is the evidence for that. The other column is the evidence against it, and we'll weigh it up. Or we'll take like a coping strategy, like I use muscle relaxation or practice mindfulness. Okay, what are the pros and cons of that?
Yeah.
So like, what are the advantages of doing that? What might be possible disadvantages of doing that? Or like I said, we'll take a strategy and say, is there a good way and a bad way of doing this, right? So what might be a bad way of thinking about problems and what might be a good way, a healthy way of thinking about them? So Socrates does something very similar. He gets Euthydemus to think about the nature of justice because he says that's his goal in life. Yeah. He wants to understand justice. And Socrates says, he writes justice and injustice at the headings of these columns. And he says, can you give me some examples of injustice? And they come up with formulaic examples like, well, lying is morally wrong and stealing is morally wrong. But then Socrates says, well, the next stage is where it becomes like a basic cognitive skill that I think underlies the whole Socratic method, the next bit. So it's useful to clarify by giving some concrete examples. But then he says, can you think of any circumstances where lying might be moved across to the other column and might be just? And he says, what, for example, if an elected general deceived the enemy in a war? Would that be unjust? And he says, well, no, that's kind of an exception. We'd consider that just. What if a parent was given medicine to a small child, and in order to get him to take it, he had to deceive him by hiding it in his food?
Yeah.
And he said, well, he's doing it for the child's benefit, so then that wouldn't be unjust. What if your friend, this is a famous example that a lot of philosophers use, what if your friend was suicidal, right? And he said, where's my dagger?
Yeah.
Right? Would you tell him the truth, or would you tell him a white lie and keep it hidden from him? Because you want to protect him. Okay, these are like exceptions, right? But then your definition's rubbish, right? Or your definition is an overgeneralization, right? Now, I mention that particular example because it struck me on many levels as being similar to things that we do in cognitive therapy. It struck me as being a method, a teaching aid that helps us to develop the basic skill of the Socratic method, but also something that psychologists today call cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to kind of see beyond rigid formulaic rules. Right? And weirdly, it reminded me of something that is maybe one of the best-selling modern self-help books, which does the complete opposite, right? Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules, right, literally consists of a set of formulaic rules. And not only that, the foreword to it valorizes the whole concept of having rigid formulaic rules to follow in life. The guy that wrote foreword even compares them to the Ten Commandments. And he says, we're not talking about loose guidelines here. Like, people need, young men in particular, need strict rules to follow and clear guidance, right? And Socrates' one of his rules is that you should tell the truth.
Yeah.
Right? Which happens to be the very example that Socrates gives in this dialogue. And then he questions it and said, but surely there are exceptions to that.
Yeah.
Wisdom doesn't consist in memorizing a bunch of formulas or rules. Socrates says that just gives you a bunch of opinions without any understanding, without any sensitivity to context, right? You're never going to get a rule or a principle like that is valid across every situation. It makes your thinking overly rigid and dependent on other people if you do that.
You know, the concept of negative capability comes to us from Keats. It basically, the idea is that you have to be able to, your mind has to be able to handle complexity, even contradiction. And
right.
that this is a higher level of thinking. And,
yes.
And I think it's not an accident that Keats is a poet.
Right.
And there's something about, if you think the world is a math equation, you're going to really struggle. If you think about it more like a poet, which is sometimes this, sometimes that,
right.
the complexity, contradiction, also, like, I think a lot of what Socrates was getting to there is that there's something ineffable about justice.
Yeah.
It defies categorization because it is so. It's both simple and complex at the same time. And to me, that is a higher level of thinking, to be able to have that, to sit with ambiguity and contradiction,
yes.
but also not
okay.
go, nothing matters.
So what you're saying, I think you call it negative capability, is perhaps similar to what we call cognitive flexibility in psychology. And as an aside, like, there are constructs that we measure in research on mental health, and one of them that's quite topical, like over the past decade or so, is something called intolerance of uncertainty. Because once you can measure something like that, you can find correlations, right? And so we know that people who are highly intolerant of uncertainty or ambiguity are more prone to generalized anxiety disorder, and I think also to clinical depression. So that there are forms of CBT that consist in training people to become more tolerant of uncertainty and ambiguity and complexity in their thinking. And Socrates definitely has, another way of putting it is, for Socrates, wisdom isn't just like a body of knowledge. Wisdom's a skill.
Yes.
Like, wisdom is a process. Like, wisdom is being able to ask, is dynamic. It's being able to ask the right questions. You cannot get it just from reading a book or listening to a speech or watching a YouTube video and memorizing what it says. Like, that would be the opposite. Like, that would drain you of wisdom, if anything, by making your thinking overly passive.
Do you think one of my favorite passages in Meditations is where Marcus Aurelius sort of lists a bunch of great conquerors and generals, and then he lists a bunch of philosophers, and I think he ends with Socrates, and he says, ultimately Socrates is the greater because his mind was his own. And I that contrast, like the philosopher having wisdom being the kind of ultimate form of power, we see this in the contrast in the ancient world between Diogenes and Alexander. Alexander is more powerful literally, but Diogenes is the greater because he understands how unnecessary most of the power that Alexander seeks is. There's something about here you have Marcus Aurelius, a wise and powerful person. Yeah. And the person he really admires is Socrates.
There's, in Plato's Gorgias, he addresses this topic directly, and it's a complex dialogue, but it has some amazing images and metaphors in it. And one of them is the image of a blindfolded swordsman. So Plato uses this, puts it in the mouth of Socrates, to explain the idea. So his followers are convinced that a political tyrant, perhaps like Alexander, who has a command of a huge army, everybody does what he says, is the most powerful person that someone can imagine. And Socrates says something typically crazy, right? He says, I think he's the most powerless person in society. And they said, what on earth are you talking about, Socrates? You're bonkers. Like, no one in their right mind believes that. Like, they really give him a lot of pushback in that dialogue. And he says, well, look, if a tyrant lacks wisdom and he doesn't really understand what the goal of life is, it would be like someone who's got a really sharp sword. So they could kill anyone they like with it. So by your analogy, they're very powerful. But suppose they're blindfolded.
Yeah.
So they can't actually see where they're waving it or who they're stabbing or what they're doing, right? So a political tyrant who isn't a philosopher might command armies, but he has no idea what it is that he should be doing. So he's like a blindfolded swordsman.
Seneca was talking about Marius, maybe, and he says, Marius commanded armies, but ambition commanded Marius.
Yeah.
And so, to take your analogy of the blindfolded swordsman, the other way is, let's say you have a swordsman they can see, but there's also a series of ropes tied to them.
Yes.
And other people and other things can jerk on these ropes anytime they want.
And pull them like a puppet.
Yeah. And when we think of puppet, we think of a puppet master deliberately making them do something. This is actually far more random and actually even more powerless, because random inputs, random distractions. You can see this right now. Like, Donald Trump may regain the presidency, but he doesn't actually have the presidency because he doesn't possess himself. It's his ego, it's his insecurities, it's whatever he sees on Twitter, it's whatever a random person who wants something from him, who's deft enough to plant a seed or pull a trigger that can make him go in a certain direction. So yes, it's literally true that they're very powerful. They control nuclear weapons, or they have a sword, or whatever it is. But just as this billionaire who has an enormous fortune is quite wealthy, but if they need something they don't have, or something else controls or can direct them, they actually don't have the power. The office has them.
Yeah. It would be like lacking wisdom would just be like being blind. Yeah. So Epictetus also, I think, compares somebody who's kind of injured in their capacity for reasoning as somebody who has a kind of disability, like being blind, but he says it's much more serious than just being blind.
Because you would know you don't have sight.
Yeah. So the famous analogy as well you reminded me of, there's another amazing image, one of my favorite images in Plato. I love Xenophon because I think his dialogues are more like cognitive therapy in some regards, right? And they've been a little bit overlooked by classicists and philosophers, but I think they're more obviously relevant to therapists. And I think the Stoics maybe realized that. But Plato has some amazing imagery. In the first Alcibiades, which some people dispute whether it's genuinely Platonic or whether someone else wrote it, but in the first Alcibiades, Socrates is discussing the nature of wisdom, and he links it to the saying at Delphi, "Gnothai auton," or know thyself, which is engraved at the entrance to the temple. It's almost like a concept that Socrates wrestled with his whole life. And in that dialogue, he says, to know thyself or to achieve wisdom would be like being an eye that sees itself. It seems impossible. And he says to Alcibiades, how would that be possible? And Alcibiades says, I guess you'd need a mirror or something. And Socrates says, well, how then would the mind know itself? And Alcibiades says, I guess in some way by using another person as a mirror, because Socrates seemed to understand that we have biases that prevent us from being able to properly evaluate our own thinking. There's evidence, actually, that leads me to another aspect of modern psychology. I interviewed recently a psychologist at the University of Waterloo called Igor Grossman, and he does research on the nature of wisdom. He has a centre for researching wisdom, right? And what he's found, I talk in the book about this concept of Iliism. He's done research on what he calls distanced self-reflection. Because first they developed a method for quantifying wisdom in reasoning. So the way that they do that is showing that people exhibit intellectual humility, openness to other perspectives, an ability to compromise, and like we were saying, an ability to embrace ambiguity and complexity in their thinking, right? Igor Grossman found that people exhibit more of that when they're analysing other people's problems than when they're analysing their own. So this is kind of intuitive. We all know this already, but psychologists can quantify it. Like they can put a percentage on the difference. It's like 20-30% difference or something like that, right? And so he said, well, what happens if you deliberately describe your own problems in a third-person perspective. That's what we call Eleism. So he got people to keep a journal of their interpersonal problems, but using their own name and using third-person pronouns. So rather than saying, I'm really upset because, my wife said something and it rubbed me up the wrong way, I would say Donald got really upset because his wife said something that rubbed him up the wrong way, as if I'm describing. It's just, all I have to do is phrase it differently. Yeah. And it seems like, and he found that when people simply did that, changed it grammatically, they exhibited more capacity for wise reasoning. I think Socrates realizes something like that. I think he understood that by engaging all day long in dialogue with other people about what he repeatedly calls the most important things in life, like, he was able to benefit from observing their thinking. And the reason that strikes me is, as a therapist, there are things that kind of just resonate. Like, if you're a therapist and you're working with clients who have depression and anxiety and stuff like that, you're very conscious that sometimes you get anxious and sometimes you get down and stuff and sometimes you get angry. And, it's easier to help the clients than it is to help yourself. But over time, you gradually benefit in an indirect way by helping other people.
Yeah.
You spot the mistakes that they keep making and the traps that they fall into, and you start to kind of realize that you're probably doing the same thing. They function to some extent as a mirror for your own problems over time.
I have a chapter about this in the wisdom book that I'm doing because I'm finishing the Cardinal Virtue series, and I think it's so fascinating that you can read a book, like a biography of someone. It could be 500 pages, it could be 200 pages, and in that series of hours, you could emerge with a better understanding of that person than the person who lived in that body for 80 years.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Just how rare and unique real self-awareness is, particularly amongst powerful, successful, ambitious people. It's almost a feature, not a but. The not knowing, like, you can see in a biography, you can see in the conversations that what's really motivating this person, what their sort of rosebud moment is in their life, and they themselves are completely oblivious to it, and how that when you see that, it shouldn't make you feel superior to that person. You should go, but how am I a stranger to myself?
Yeah.
And we all are strangers to ourselves in alarming ways.
Perhaps in a way it's a fundamental aspect of the human. This is the I that doesn't see itself.
Yeah.
It's a perspective on the world that doesn't understand its own biases, its own perspective. I mean, in psychotherapy, this is integral to modern therapy. We train the clients to be able to shift their perspective so they become better at observing their own biases and viewing them. We call this, again, like cognitive distancing, being able to view yourself from that point of view. So, I think Socrates... And the other thing that Socrates does, he doesn't really do Eleism much, but he does something that's very similar. He frequently engages in hypothetical dialogues.
Yeah.
So he'll, even I think in the Apology at one point, he imagines having a little debate with the jury. And he said, you guys would probably criticize me and say this, and this is how I would respond. And so he often has these little hypothetical dialogues. In the Critias, he uses a technique called apostrophe, where he personifies the laws of Athens and imagines that they're criticizing him. But in doing that, by having imaginary or hypothetical dialogues, we have to refer to ourselves in the second person. Yeah. So the laws go, Socrates, you're making an error by doing this, but it's Socrates that's doing that. I think of it almost like you've got a sock puppet, and that represents the laws, and you're going, Socrates, you're making a mistake by doing, but it's your hand that's moving the lips, right? Yeah. So you're really using your imagination to adopt this role of someone that's observing you and able to criticize more objectively on you. There's a bit in the Theaetetus. There's often these really weird little... Some of the most remarkable things about Socrates are just said, and it's often the case just as a flippant passing remark, right? In a dialogue that's about something else. So in the Theaetetus, in passing, Socrates says that when he goes home after debating with people, there's a guy waiting for him who's like a weird stranger that lives in his house, and he leaps out and sort of accosts him and criticizes him for not really understanding the nature of wisdom and justice. And then he says this person that accosts him, this weird critical stranger, is like another Socrates, right? So he's describing in a weird way continuing the dialogue at home in his imagination, using the second person grammatically, like this guy's saying Socrates, like you contradicted yourself earlier when you said this.
In marketing, there's an exercise which is like you have this idea for something, like a product, and you write the press release first. You write the press release announcing it to the public for the first time. So you're describing it in the third person, the thing that you haven't made exist yet.
Yeah.
And it forces you to think all the way to the end and think about how you would explain it to another third party. And so you're forced to see, it's again cognitive dissonance. Instead of being so lost in your enthusiasm and excitement for the thing, you have to flash forward to the end and describe it as it is. And I think those kind of exercises that get you outside yourself is how you know yourself and what you are trying to do or need to do.
This has become, I'll tell you a little story about this. Like when Aaron T. Beck introduced cognitive therapy in the 1960s, right? The central technique he called Socratic questioning, because he'd read Plato's Republic at college. And it's a bit different from the way Socrates questions, but similar kind of concept. And Beck's main question was, where's the evidence for that? Nobody likes me, everybody hates me. Where's the evidence for that? And then he'd ask other questions to encourage the client to reevaluate their rigid assumptions or beliefs. But he realized there was a problem, because some people were so fused with their beliefs that they didn't even see them as debatable, right? So they'd lose their job and they think it's a catastrophe, right? And Beck might say, well, where's the evidence for that? Yeah. What are the pros and cons of viewing it that way? And they'd say, you don't understand. It just is a catastrophe, right? It objectively is a disaster. It's the only way of seeing it. They have kind of tunnel vision for it. And so Beck realized there's something that has to happen as a prerequisite before we can even begin evaluating whether you're right or wrong, or whether this is the whole story. Are there any errors in your reasoning? For you, it's not up for debate, right? And this first step is the cognitive distancing. It's kind of related to what you're describing, the ability to step back and see, no, this is just one opinion about the situation, and it might not be the whole story or the only way of looking at it. But before you can even begin doing cognitive disputation, the individual, the client, has to be able to view their own opinions as hypotheses. And
that thing from Epictetus, it sounds so basic. It's not things that upset us, it's our opinion about things. But it's such a fundamental paradigm.
It's foundational.
That and to once if you can't open that up, a whole bunch of things is closed off to you. If you can, a whole bunch of possibilities are possible for you.
What happened in most people have heard of CBT, cognitive therapy and stuff like that, but I think people are only gradually becoming more aware that cognitive therapy has gone through sort of three phases in its history, we usually say. There's what we call the first wave, which was behavior therapy, like using conditioning and stuff. And then the second wave was Beck and Ellis and CBT and REBT and stuff like that. But then about 20 years ago, a third wave began emerging that we call the mindfulness and acceptance approach. Yeah. And it consists of lots of different therapies developed by different research teams at different universities all over the world that all converged in a similar kind of direction. And one of the things that they did was test these techniques for gaining cognitive distancing. So Beck thought this is the kind of initial step, and then you do the disputation. And some of the researchers started to say, well, what happens if you just do the distancing part and put more emphasis on that? And what so they called that radical distance, or comprehensive distancing is what they initially called it. What happens if you just do that bit and get people to view their thoughts objectively, but don't even bother disputing them, right? And they found that was much more therapeutic than Beck had assumed. Right, so actually the disputation part still plays a role in cognitive therapy, but it's not as central in some approaches as it used to be. This initial shift in perspective has become much more important. And people realized early on, if you can take a step back and observe your thoughts, it's a bit like what happens in meditation. So people, when they're practicing mindfulness meditation, are told, when a thought crosses your mind, don't get entangled with it or swept away with it. Just view it as if it's a cloud passing across.
That there's a distance between you and the thing.
Yeah, we have to use all these kind of quirky little... So it's like it's viewing it as an event that's happening in your mind rather than kind of getting locked into it and viewing the world through the lens of that thought.
Does Doesn't Epictetus say that that's like kind of the first thing a philosopher does is have
Yeah.
the ability to analyze your own thoughts?
Yeah. But first of all, you have to see them as thoughts,
not facts.
not facts. Like Korzybski used to say, it's just not confusing the map with the terrain. Like the thoughts, not facts. He also says this when he says, when you have a troubling impression, you should say to it, you're just an impression,
Yes.
and not the thing itself.
Yes.
Right? That is literally, he's describing cognitive distance, like verbatim. It's even clearer in the Greek. Right? And also he's using a technique.
He says, let me put you to the test.
Yeah. He says, so you're just a thought. You're not reality. You're just one way of looking at things. Right there, like he perfectly captures. It's actually really weird that these guys seem to genuinely have understood some of these psychological phenomena, because you might think, well, okay, like some of it's maybe kind of common sense. Psychotherapy has been around for actually about over 150 years-ish in the modern world. It really started with the hypnotists, and then hypnosis evolved into psychoanalysis and stuff like that. But Freud and Jung and these guys did not fully appreciate some of these phenomena in cognitive psychology. So we kind of take it more for granted now, and we have lots of different ways of teaching people these skills. But older models of psychotherapy are kind of oblivious to this. So it's really weird to go back 2,000 years and find people that had a better understanding of human psychology than Freud and Jung. And
it's like finding out that they knew the cure for scurvy, and then we forgot about it for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And then rediscovered it. Like they at some level, they didn't explicitly, they were like, these two things are associated with each other. This is a way to prevent this thing from happening. And then we kind of lost that connective tissue, and then have only in a shockingly recent times begun to be able to make that explicit and clear.
And I'll tell you something even weirder about it, right? So Ellis was really into Epictetus and very influenced by him, but he kind of largely left out all the stuff in Stoicism about living in accord with virtues, and the stuff about prosoche, or being continually mindful of your thoughts, and the emphasis on distancing that you find, right? So he was influenced in kind of other ways. And so the third wave in cognitive behavioral therapy put a lot more emphasis on mindfulness, detached observation of thoughts, identifying your core values and living in accord with them in a way that's virtually identical to how virtues are understood in ancient philosophy. So even in cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of these things weren't fully understood until about 20 years ago. Like they were only really reintroduced in the third wave. And when those guys did it, they took inspiration from Buddhist mindfulness and stuff. The third wave in CBT makes virtually no reference to Stoicism, even though some of the main things that they're emphasizing are pretty explicit. And like the virtues, there's an entire approach that one of the leading evidence-based approaches to treating clinical depression is called behavioral activation. And it completely revolves around this idea of identifying distinguishing between values that are about character traits and values that are about external outcomes, and how depressed people typically put too much importance on the external outcomes, and getting them to cherish character traits more and engage in activities more consistent with them. So systematically doing exactly what virtue ethics talks about.
Amazing.
But they never mention Stoicism, right? Weirdly. And so they reinvented the wheel.
It's because it doesn't get taught, and there's not that basic, like if those people had grown up repeating the epigrams of Seneca in Latin class, maybe it would have been familiar, right? Like there's just a gap in people's. And hopefully this is what the resurgence of Stoic wisdom is bringing, is people's ability to connect these 2,000-year-old ideas with what we're also understanding and seeing in the world around us.
I was wrong about something, which is when I first got involved with studying Stoicism, the first book I wrote, I kind of really thought, I mainly spoke at conferences for psychotherapists, and I trained psychotherapists and supervised them. And so I thought psychotherapists would be the ones getting on board with Stoicism. And they didn't really, and there are reasons for that. One reason is that cognitive behavioral therapists tend to turn their nose up at anything old, and they're kind of trained to look at the latest research and not to kind of look backwards so much. So they've got a bit of an aversion to doing anything that isn't cutting edge, kind of evidence based. That's their orientation.
Sure.
So I underestimated how that would maybe distract them from looking at something as old as Stoicism. But what happened over time is Stoicism, as you've probably noticed, is what the young people call a thing today. It's an entire genre of self-help, partly due to you. It's your fault. So Stoicism has become so. It's actually, as you were saying to me last time we spoke, in some ways it really has now become so popular. Its popularity is raising its own problems, right? But what happens now is I hear a lot of psychotherapists saying their clients are turning up and saying, this stuff that you're doing with me in the sessions is similar to stuff that I've read about in Ryan Holiday's books, or that I've seen, people talking about in Stoicism. And then the therapists are kind of guilt-tripped in a good way into having to shuffle off and, get up to speed on Stoicism because they'd be embarrassed to sit there for the clients to be lecturing them on how this is 2,000 years old and they didn't know anything about it. So in a roundabout way, we're getting gradually penetrating into the world of therapy.
I love it. You want to go check out some books?
Yeah, sure.
Let's do it.